The dust in the valley didn't care about a man's pride, and neither did the heat. Thomas gripped the worn leather reins of his buggy, his mind anchored 3 miles back at a cabin that smelled of fever. His 7-year-old daughter, Clara, was burning up. He had swallowed his dignity an hour ago, standing on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch. The owner, a man whose wealth was measured in thousands of rolling acres, hadn't even looked up from his ledger. 3 or 4 days, Thomas. I'll review the books then. Do something for me first. Take my daughter Lucy down to the mercantiles. Thomas had nodded. Desperation makes a man compliant. Lucy Blackwood climbed into the buggy with the rustle of expensive silk and a scent like crushed lavender. She didn't speak to him. To her, Thomas was just an extension of the wooden seat. When he dropped her by the dry goods store, she swept out, leaving a small beaded velvet purse on the floorboards. Thomas didn't notice it. He was already scanning the dusty street for passengers, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Just $1, just enough for the dock. 10 minutes later, a storm broke, but there was no rain. Lucy returned, her face flushed crimson, her breath coming in sharp, angry gasps. "Where is it?" she demanded, tearing at the buggy's leather apron. "My purse. It's gone. You took it." "Ma'am, I haven't moved from this bench," Thomas said, trying to anchor his rising panic. "I haven't seen any purse. You're a liar." Her voice pierced the midday quiet, drawing a crowd of shopkeepers and local hands. "Sheriff! Sheriff! Come here!" Before Thomas could climb down, a hand gripped his collar. Sheriff Miller, a man who judged people by the grease on their shirts, dragged him to the dirt. Lucy's palm cracked across Thomas's cheek, a stinging insult that burned worse than the sun. "Look at him, Sheriff. He's desperate. He was begging my father for money this morning," she spat. "Please," Thomas pleaded, looking at the stone-faced townspeople. "Search the buggy. Search me. But let me go home. My girl is sick. She's burning with the fever." "Save it for the circuit judge," Miller grunted, shoving him toward the iron bars of the town lockup. The cell was cold, smelling of old pine and damp earth. Thomas sank to the floor, his head in his hands. He didn't care about the bruises or the shame. He cared about the silence of his cabin, wondering if Clara's breathing had stopped. Meanwhile, a mile down the road, a drifting trail hand named Micah sat behind the livery stable, dumping the contents of the velvet purse onto a hay bale. He found $40 in gold coin and a small, folded calling card bearing the Blackwood name and address. Micah wasn't a good man, but he wasn't hollow. He had lost a sister to the winter croup years back. The town gossip about Thomas's sick little girl had already reached the livery. Micah looked at the money, then at the card. A heavy, suffocating guilt pressed into his chest. He shoved the coins back into the velvet, walked up to the Blackwood Manor, and flung the purse onto the porch before disappearing into the brush. When Lucy found it, intact, her heart dropped. The world around her suddenly felt very quiet and very cold. She hurried to the jailhouse, the heavy velvet purse clutched in her hand like a stone. "Let him out, Miller," she whispered to the sheriff. "It was a mistake, I found it." The iron door groaned open. Thomas stepped out into the sunlight, his face pale, his eyes hollowed out by a long night of agony. Lucy stepped into his path, extending a fistful of gold coins. "Thomas, I didn't know. I was angry. Take this for the doctor, please." Thomas looked at the gold, then up into her eyes. There was no anger in his face, only a profound, weary distance. He didn't take the money. "You didn't listen," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room. "I told you my little girl was failing. I told you I needed to get back. You looked right at me, and you chose to see a thief because it was easier than seeing a man. Your money can't buy back the hours I spent wondering if my daughter was dying alone." He walked past her, leaving her standing in the dust with her useless gold. When Thomas reached his cabin, his boots heavy, he braced himself for the worst. But as he pushed the door open, he smelled fresh broth. His neighbor, Martha, a widow who knew the cruelty of the frontier all too well, was sitting by the hearth, wringing out a cool cloth. Clara's fever had broken. She was sleeping peacefully. Martha had seen Thomas being taken to town and had immediately walked over to tend the child. The community, however, didn't forget. Gossip in a small territory is a living thing. The townspeople realized how easily they had turned on one of their own. Lucy found herself isolated. The local women turned their backs when she passed, and the shopkeepers served her with stiff, silent formality. Shame turned into a quiet, stubborn resolve. Lucy began walking the 3 miles to Thomas's cabin. The first time, he didn't open the door. She left a basket of fresh bread on the porch. The second time, she brought a wooden doll for Clara. Thomas allowed her to leave it, but he didn't speak. On the third week, she found him in the yard, trying to mend a broken wheel with a fractured wrist, an injury from his arrest that hadn't healed right. "Let me help," she said, picking up the heavy iron wrench before he could protest. She held the grease-stained wood while he directed her. For 3 hours, they worked in a tense, heavy silence, the shared labor slowly wearing down the sharp edges of their history. The real turning point came on a Saturday, during the monthly town market. The square was crowded. Lucy walked out into the center of the dust, directly toward Thomas's buggy. The crowd quieted, expecting another confrontation. Instead, Lucy stood before him, untied her fine bonnet, and dropped to her knees in the dirt. "I wronged you, Thomas," she said, her voice ringing out across the silent market. "I let my pride blind me, and I used my family's name to crush a decent man when he was at his lowest. I ask for your forgiveness, not because I deserve it, but because I want to spend the rest of my days learning how to be half as honest as you are." The territory had never seen a Blackwood kneel in the dirt. Thomas looked down at her. He saw the dust staining her fine clothes, saw the genuine tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks. The pride that had protected him for weeks finally softened. He reached down, took her gloved hand, and lifted her to her feet. "The dirt don't suit you, Lucy. Stand up." It wasn't a sudden romance born of lightning, but a slow growth born of grit. Lucy kept coming back, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as a woman willing to learn the hard realities of the valley. She learned to cook over an open hearth from Martha. She learned to listen to the quiet rhythms of the frontier. And Clara grew to love the sound of Lucy's voice reading stories by the lantern light. A year later, under the shade of the cottonwood trees by the creek, they were married. There were no grand invitations, just a handful of neighbors who had watched 2 proud people bend so they wouldn't break. As they drove back to the cabin in the old buggy, the velvet purse was gone, replaced by a shared reins and a quiet understanding that trust, once broken, makes a stronger weld when mended with humility.